before listening to this sermon, you should read Job chapter 1 and chapter 2. That's Job chapter 1 and chapter 2, which can be found in the Old Testament of the Bible. And during the next 5 weeks, we'll be going through the book of Job. It's a book that centres on the theme of suffering. But before we begin, I'd just like to ask you a question. If you were to pick up a book about suffering, what type of book would you choose? Would you choose a book titled Suffering Avoided? A book about how all types of unwanted suffering can be avoided. Avoid these 5 foods and you're guaranteed to avoid cancer. Eat this vitamin and never suffer from tiredness again. Avoiding suffering is something we'd all choose. Or maybe you'd choose a book titled Suffering Explained, a book explaining why suffering takes place. Titles might include Why God Allows the Good, the Bad and the Ugly. Or the title might be All Things Work for Good, 101 Good Reasons Why God Allowed Your Goldfish to Die. Or perhaps the title of the book might be Suffering Relieved, a book containing the magic bullet by which all our problems may be gone. A 5-step guide to health and healing, the prayer by which all your problems will evaporate away. We're all in a search for how our suffering might be relieved. Avoided, explained, relieved. These are the types of books on suffering that we want. However, in the New Testament book of James, James reflects on the book of Job in the following way. James writes, Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance, and you have seen what the Lord finally brought about. If the book of Job was to have a title, Patience and Perseverance would probably be in it. For a faith characterized by patience and perseverance are essential qualities every Christian needs. But why? Why is faith so essential to the Christian's journey in this fallen world? Why do you and I need faith if we want to survive? Well, first of all, suffering cannot be avoided. Suffering cannot be avoided. Take Job, for example. Job was born with a fertile sperm count, and he was born into a place where his farming business instantly flourished. For these reasons, Job enjoyed a first world lifestyle, something that can often deceive people into thinking difficulties will never come their way. Yet, in one day, Job lost it all. And though we read that there were unique reasons why this happened, it's a helpful reminder that we live in a fallen world. Disasters, difficulties and death do happen, no matter where you live and no matter who you are. And for this reason, it's essential we're prepared with a deep faith in God that can survive such times. Secondly, suffering cannot always be explained. In verses 6 to 12, we get a detailed explanation of the background to Job's suffering, and yet even this leaves us with more questions than answers. Why did God just not tell Satan to shut up when he asked for permission to hurt Job's business and his family? Why did God not do something to make Job's suffering a lot less? We're given some background story, and yet we're still left asking questions. Job knew none of this background information, and so his confusion would have been so much more. The next 40 chapters of the book of Job reinforce this point. There's no easy, simple, straightforward answer to the problem of suffering. And so in suffering, it's faith in God, not faith in detailed explanations, that are the key to survival. We may never fully understand the problem of suffering. What we most need is faith in God. Faith in a God who does. And thirdly and lastly, no matter how many vitamins you consume, no matter what self-help guide you follow, no matter how much or how hard you pray, there's no guarantee that your suffering will be relieved. Yes, the Bible speaks of eternal relief from suffering for all those who have faith in Jesus. This is a wonderful truth, and we'll be looking at it in a few weeks' time. But though the Bible speaks of the wonderful relief from all suffering that will be ours in the future, all believers can expect to suffer to some degree in the here and in the now. A book on faith and suffering is the type of book that you and I need. And that's what we find in the book of Job. So, first of all, faith defined. Faith defined. I'd like you to picture for a moment a newly married couple enjoying a candlelit meal on February the 14th. Both are looking lovingly into the other's eyes and enjoy the 4-course meal that the wife has just made, including a fabulous strawberry cheesecake. The wife asks her husband, "Do you love me?" "Yes, I will always love you," the husband replies. "That's good," the wife says, "because I can no longer afford makeup, and for the next 6 months you'll be cooking tea. And did I mention I've just invited your mother-in-law to move in?" Strip away the makeup, the meals, and the opportunity for romance, and the true nature of that husband's love will be revealed. Does he love his wife for her strawberry cheesecake, or does he love her for who she is? Is his version of love lust, or is his version of love love? In chapter 1, verses 8 to 12, Job's love of God is up for question. Does Job really love God for God's sake, or does he just love God for his gifts? Is Job really a fan of the cheesecake that God gave him in the form of health and wealth, or is Job really a fan of God himself? Satan proposes the idea that Job only loves God because God makes Job's life comfortable, the accusation being that Job loves the gifts of God more than the giver. Verse 9. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied. Have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? You have blessed the work of his hands, so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land. But now stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, Very well then, everything he has is in your power, but on the man himself do not lay a finger. And so God takes away these other loves, the love of family and prosperity. God takes these things away from Job, but amazingly, Job's faith and love of God remain unchanged. Job ends chapter 1 worshipping God, and contrary to Satan's argument, Job's suffering causes him to turn to God rather than causing Job to turn away. Job's love and faith in God are up for question yet again in chapter 2, verses 1 to 6. Yes, Job may have trusted God when Job had it all, but would Job still trust God when God was all that Job had? When all Job had was God's wisdom, would Job still trust God when his suffering didn't make any logical sense to him? When all Job had was God's promise that God was righteous and just, would Job still cling on to these facts when he suffered for reasons that seemed unfair? When all Job had was the hope that God would and could answer, could Job still trust God when the answer seems distant and far away? Job previously had it all, but would Job still love and trust God when God was all that Job had? The answer to this question was yes. Yes, Job's faith in God did survive his terrible ordeal. For this type of faith that Job had wasn't faith in his circumstances. Job didn't trust God when circumstances were okay, but not when they were not. Job's faith in God wasn't faith in feelings. Job didn't just trust God when Job felt very happy, just when he felt happy, as if all was right in the world. Job's faith wasn't faith in human reason. Job didn't just trust God when life made sense to him. Job had true faith, a true faith in God, God's definition of faith, a faith that trusts and loves God in all circumstances, at all times, no matter how we are feeling. In all circumstances, in all types of difficulty, in all of life's confusion, in all the happy times as well as the sad. That's what true faith is all about. That was faith defined, trusting God at all times. And secondly, faith displayed. Faith displayed. Now, cats are often described as having 9 lives, this being because cats have a way of surviving the situations that would finish most other animals off. Throw anything at them, throw them out of a window of any height. In all of these situations, a cat will survive. For cats have the reputation of always landing on their 4 feet. Now, at many times in Job's story, Job's faith in God was under threat. Many times it would seem as if Job's faith was going to die. Job, in the chapters that follow, he questions God's wisdom. He questions God's goodness. He questions God's justice. He questions if God actually cares. 9 times and more, Job's faith looked like it was going to die, and yet Job's faith survived. Job's faith survived, and here is the reason why. When thrown off a skyscraper, a cat will twist, turn and do 4 backward somersaults before reaching the ground. But because the cat always lands on all 4 feet, that's all that counts. Yes, from floors 31-3, the cat may have been spinning around frantically, falling towards the ground. But it's the way you land, not the way you fall, that counts. In much the same way, Job's suffering threw his faith into turmoil. Job's experience of suffering caused Job to question all that he previously believed. And so between chapters 31 to chapter 3, we see Job thrown from faith to doubt and from certainty to questioning. How can God be just and good when suffering seems so cruel and unfair? Job asked such questions in his turmoil. But like with cats, it's how you land, not how you fall, that counts. Throughout all Job's questions, throughout all of his complaints, Job turned to God every time, looking to God for answers, looking to God for relief. And because Job's 2 feet always landed on this foundation, the foundation of God, Job's faith survived. So what is the definition of faith? Trust in God. And how is that faith displayed? Not through ignoring the reality of suffering, not through coming up with pat answers that do not properly answer the problem of pain, not through pretending patience and perseverance are easy, when quite clearly they are not. Faith is displayed through wrestling with doubts and questions, and facing the problem of suffering face on, whilst never forgetting to land these problems at God's feet. Looking to God's word for wisdom, and trusting his wisdom when only partial answers are given. looking to God for his promise of relief, and still trusting him when that relief seems far away. Looking to the many reminders of who God is in his word, and holding on to the unchanging character of God when everything else in life might seem to contradict it. God does care if you come out God doesn't care if you come out of the other side of suffering looking like you've been dragged through a hedge backwards, an appearance that shows that you found the process of suffering difficult. What God cares about is that you and I always look to him. God is the firm foundation all of us need. So faith defined, faith displayed, and lastly faith discovered. I always used to enjoy watching the detective drama Jonathan Creek. Like all good detective dramas, the story unfolds in such a way that you begin asking all the questions that the detective will eventually answer in the end. Why was there blood on the carpet despite the cause of death being stabbing? How could there be no witnesses when the time of death was in the middle of the day? Where was the butler for the 2 hours whilst rigor mortis set in? At the end of all detective dramas, there is that wonderful moment where all the pieces of the jigsaw magically fit into place. At last, all our questions are answered. At last, the mystery is solved. The book of Job takes us on this journey. For as we follow Job through his experience of suffering, we begin to ask all the questions that Job himself would have probably asked. Why? Why is the question that Job and we would probably ask. For in chapters 1 and 2 we see Satan ask for God's permission to afflict Job. And immediately we ask the question, why? Why would God allow this to happen? That's the why question, and then there's the when question. After 35 more chapters of unanswered suffering and despair, we're drawn to ask the question, when? When will God provide Job with relief? And then there's the where question. From chapters 3 to 37, God is entirely absent. If God cares, where is God in it all? And then there's the how question. We join Job in asking the how question of how a good and fair God could allow blameless Job to suffer. How could God allow such injustice to take place? By the time we reach chapter 38 in the book of Job, we're anticipating the appearance of God, our detective, the one who will answer all our questions so that the problem of suffering suddenly makes sense. However, throughout the last chapters of Job, none of our why, when, where, and how questions are answered. Instead, we only discover the answer of who. Who is all wise? Who is all powerful? Who could Job look to for comfort in it all? If you read chapters 38 to 42 of Job, we only find the answers to the question of who. Who is all wise? Who is all powerful? Who could Job turn to in all of his confusion? The answer to this who question is God. And when it comes to persevering in faith, during times of suffering, that is the answer that you and I need. For what is the use of answering the whodunit question if the person who done it is still allowed to run free? We all want a detective who can deal with criminals, more than a detective who can only tell us the details about how he solved the crime. In the same way, what's the use of having all of our questions related to suffering answered if God cannot answer the problem of suffering itself? If God cannot end all suffering? If God is unable to comfort us while we wait? If God is as powerless and confused as us in the face of suffering? If this is true, then there's no way we're ever going to face suffering and survive. What we need most of all is not an answer to the why or when or where or how questions related to suffering. Intellectual and rational answers are not the key that we need. The answer we most need is who. Who can we turn to in our suffering? And the answer the book of Job gives is God. We can turn to God's wisdom and trust that He can bring good out of suffering. We can turn to God's power and trust that He will one day bring all suffering to an end. We can turn to God for comfort when everything else about suffering is painful. We can turn to God with the complaints, questions and doubts that suffering causes to voice, trusting that God is big enough and compassionate enough to deal with them all. The answer we most need is who. Who can we turn to in our suffering? And it's through turning to God in our suffering that our faith in God grows and our faith survives. So that's the first study in our book of Job, faith in suffering. Maybe before you listen to the next week's sermon, you might like to read a little bit more of the book of Job. It's an excellent book, and you'll benefit greatly from reading from chapter 1 to chapter 42 at some point during the next 5 weeks.